This time we're going to talk about some macro forces that determine real estate values for a specific area. Developers and real estate investors, they use the types of approaches which we'll see here, as well as some others, to figure out what geographic areas to invest in. And so if you understand which cities and regions are going to grow in real estate, that minimizes your risk because of simply supply and demand. Assuming supply stays relatively fixed, more demand pushes up the price of housing. So even if the economy weakens, you're in the right real estate market, you still might be relatively okay. Of course, supply isn't fixed, and that's one thing that you'll have to analyze. But the key is that in this topic, it's all about evaluating where to invest based on looking at urban growth patterns and then comparing that to expected supply. Simple, but extremely effective strategy to picking the right real estate markets to invest in. And so to think about what drives population growth, it's worth thinking first about how cities generally get started. And they get started because people need to be there for some reason. In the pre-industrial era, that might have been a nearby fortress where people were seeking protection from raiders. But in the early US, cities got started because often they were a center point for transport or agricultural activity, like where Chicago became the center point between railroads expanding west and canal waterways to transport goods east. Or cities, they just got started because it was near a large natural resource. So Houston and Dallas got started that way when oil deposits were first found in Texas. And San Francisco originally got its start as a mining town, gold mining, the major stocking point along the way for miners entering California to participate in the gold rush in the 1800s. These are what originally got these cities started, and in some cases they still contribute to their vitality, but for most of them, once that base was established, economic activity within these cities branched off into other things. And so growth or vitality for these cities was maintained through other industries. But whatever that industry is, or that activity, we call that major activity for the city an economic base. And one well-known economic base, for example, would be Detroit with its automobile industry. All three of the big legacy car makers are headquartered there, and it's been the place for automobile manufacturing and design ever since the combustion engine became mass-produced with Ford. And it's also an interesting example because it shows the risk to the city of having one single industrial economic base. Detroit has been in decline ever since the 1980s when international rivals started taking a lot of their business. And things have really only gotten worse for the city since then as the domestic car industry has declined further. But broadly speaking, an economic base is something that consistently brings income into a city. You don't have to have just one economic base. It's something that a major source of export or income for the city's inhabitants. And you can have more than one. In San Francisco, you might say that we have two or even more economic bases. So one is technology. A lot of companies are located here, and the services they provide are sold to other companies all around the world in the form of software. But this provides income to the San Francisco's residents and tax income to run the city. But San Francisco is also a tourist destination. So revenue comes into the city from all the visitors, which it gets each year. And that also means money to residents, which work in that industry, as well as more tax dollars to the city. But these economic bases, these major drivers to a city's growth and vitality, they also have knock-on benefits. And we call those secondary or local activities. And this means that the income earned from all those tech employees or from all those catering to tourists in the city, a lot of that income gets spent on local stuff. things like real estate, restaurants, and government services. And these are all themselves activities which create employment opportunities for real estate agents, for restaurant workers, or for government jobs. And so this hub and spoke kind of economic engine, base activity driving local activity, that's the way in which real estate people and city planners like to tend to think about how economic growth works in cities. So the idea is that as the base stays healthy, so does the rest of the city. Strong revenue generation from the major industries has knock-on effects to the other activities within that city. And these multiplier effects can be strongest in cities which are more isolated, because in those cases, it's just stronger effects from an economic base, because it's going to be the sole driving force of that local economy. Cities that are more diversified, however, meaning that they have multiple economic bases, they tend themselves to enjoy benefit because, as we finance folks know, diversification is incredibly important for maintaining stability. One thing is down, the other thing might be up, and they cancel each other out, creating a smoother economic cycle for that city over the long run. So New York, for example, was hit incredibly hard after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, as basically the city was heavily dependent on just one industry, the finance industry. San Francisco at that time did relatively better, because while it did have a strong financial industry, it's sort of the Wall Street of the West Coast, it also had tech and it had tourism. And diversified core economic bases like this, they also tend to promote population growth. And when you have population growth, you tend to have more tax being collected, which can then be funneled into more city services like parks and public transportation. And so these things themselves, the parks, the transportation, city services, if done well, they can lead to additional population growth and kind of a positive feedback loop. So here's a visual example of that same idea. The number one that you see at the top right there is the introduction of revenue into the city via quote-unquote exports, which just means people or companies working in that city and earning money, where that money is earned because they built something that people outside of the city want to buy. So for San Francisco, a lot of that is technology products. For Sacramento, a lot of that is going to be government services as the capital of California. And for Los Angeles, you have the entertainment industry and the ports and various types of industrial. And that money coming in to people in that industry then gets spent locally. And so to some extent on local services like restaurants, real estate, tax preparers, everything else. And some of that doesn't. Some of it goes into savings or to services not generated locally, but a big chunk of it does. The activity for this section asks you to evaluate and analyze an economic base for a city, among other things. And so on that note, here are some resources to help you do that. Basically, the census is the major place for that. You may know the census as that government agency which counts how many people are in the country, doing it every 10 years. That's a big thing that they do. But the census actually does a lot of data collection on more than just the population count. They collect and publish geographic level data on things like income, job roles, housing preferences, rent that gets paid, so rental amounts, and all sorts of other data on housing, and you'd be surprised at how many different things they get data on. And some of this data can be very granular too, not just like at the citywide level, but statistics down to areas as small as just a few blocks, for example, in some cases. And so in the real estate industry, you'll find that the US Census Bureau is an invaluable resource whenever you want to do any type of analysis. Let's walk through an example of how we might use this economic base idea in practice as real estate professionals. So one way is just first to identify which industries are most important to a city or region. And so let's say we're looking at data from the census to do that on a city, and we see that 20% are employed in the education industry, which means things like schools, but it would also mean public, private university employees, teaching hospitals, other private providers of educational services. So 20%, that sounds like a big lot, like a big chunk of the working population. I mean, that's 1 in 5 of every working adult. But really, to put that in perspective, we might compare that to the national average. So again, using data from the US Census. And there, we see that on average, 9% of the workforce is employed in the education industry nationally. And that's compared to our 20% for this city. And so the city's industry, the education industry, has 2.22 times the normal employment. And that tells us that this industry is probably a big export and source of income for the town. So, for instance, to make that more concrete, it might be a university town like Chico up in Northern California. There's a lot of students, they tend to be from somewhere else and they go and study there. And then they provide income to the town where there's not a lot of other income going on other than in that particular area, maybe agriculture. Whether an economic base develops in a city, it depends a lot on what's going on around it. As we talked about, big cities, they originally got their start because of some sort of geographic advantage. I mean, San Francisco being centrally located for the start of miners entering the gold rush, Chicago having an ideal waterway and railroad links to connect farming in the Midwest with manufacturing along the northeastern states. But if we're city officials and we're trying to grow our city economically, we don't always have the luxury of being gifted with some natural geographic advantage like that. And so what are some of the other ways as city planners that we can grow our city? And one of the answers to that is to improve the characteristics of our labor force. One of the reasons that the San Francisco Bay Area became the technological powerhouse that it is now is that it had a large supply of extremely well-educated people. We have SFSU, but we also have Berkeley, we have Stanford, and a number of other state, private universities and private colleges concentrated in like a relatively small geographic area. So this means that the employers, they can easily find highly skilled people here, and so they're more likely to set up business here. And then the income from those high-skilled jobs flows back into the local economy in the form of the secondary spending that we've been talking about. But quality of life matters too. I mean, San Francisco has its problems, no doubt about that. But one thing the city planners have done well is to reinvest tax income wisely in the form of city parks and attractions, along with improving public transportation, like increasing the number of muni routes that are being dug through the city and, through the design of the Transbay Terminal. I mean, you want to have an attractive place to live, so people will actually want to live there and therefore spend money and pay taxes there. And a lot of the debate that you see right now, it ultimately revolves around that. I mean, government officials in the city are realizing that there's some serious quality of life issues that have been neglected for one reason or another, and that's starting to have a noticeable effect on people's decision on whether they want to live here versus the rest of the Bay Area, now that more of them have a choice due to remote work or hybrid work. And businesses are thinking along the same lines as individuals, and it's presenting like a real scary scenario for San Francisco's planners as they really need to figure out how to keep both businesses and people happy to live here in this new era of remote or semi-remote work. But San Francisco still does benefit from some natural economies of scale, though, and so that's positive. And economies of scale, or efficiencies of production as the textbook terms, it means that life and the ability to do business is just easier when everything is clustered in one place. So take the construction of airplanes, for example. Not San Francisco related, totally different. These are instead produced either in a regional area in northern Washington state or in and around Wichita, Kansas. And manufacturers in this industry, they cluster because it's very complicated to build planes. You literally have millions of parts which go into the assembly of a jumbo jet. And when you're a manufacturer, apart from the supply chain, when you're a part of this supply chain, when you're clustered together like that, it's a lot easier to fix something in the design. You can iterate on a design, fix something, or just plain deliver your product. It's easier when you're close by to both your own suppliers as well as the people you sell to. And so business in an industry, they tend to cluster together. And if a new business is formed in the industry, it'll also tend to want to locate there to be next to all the action. This kind of clustering is also known in real estate as something called the agglomeration effect. And it can happen in any industry, not just aircraft, but also medicine, education, financial services, and others. South San Francisco and the biotech industry is another great example of an agglomeration economy. City officials there are very active in trying to promote the biotech industry there. They're very acutely aware of the long-term benefits to the local economy from an industry like that and its tendency to cluster. And I mean, the College of Business, for example, actually offers a biotech MBA focused in South San Francisco. And I can remember when we first got that program going, the city of South San Francisco actually gave us the use of their city hall to hold classes there. That just kind of shows you how much they care about fostering the biotech industry there. And it's because they want to kind of produce an agglomeration effect. They want more biotech to be there, and the very fact that more biotech is there will attract additional biotech to be there as well. So these agglomeration effects in a city, they're really nice because even in an economic or industry downturn, local companies are still hesitant to move away. It's still the best place to be because their entire supply chain and workforce is still there. And so these types of network effects are what you might call sticky, in other words. They're benefits that tend to persist through thick and thin if they're managed carefully. And industry clusters are also nice because that tends to be a supportive place for new business in the industry. I mean, if a founder has a great idea and starts a company, they'll have great local access to industry contacts and advice already. It's a nice advantage. And for any supplies they need or employees they need to acquire, costs for those are going to be a lot lower because they're more readily available. And so that's also a way in which industry clustering can beget more growth. Now, all of our discussion so far has been kind of macro, meaning that we talked about supply and demand and industry bases and clustering, but we haven't really used it from the perspective of maybe a more focused real estate investor. So let's take a different tack for a little while and cover something called a bid-rent model. And this is something that a real estate investor or a property developer can use to decide what a potential rental might go for or what a property might sell for. The approach, it ultimately boils down to the time is money maxim. I mean, essentially that workers factor in the cost of their commute time when figuring out how close to live to their place of work. In this approach, we use this idea, use some reasonable assumptions and approximations to reality for whatever market we're studying, and then we use data from the US Census, Google Maps, and maybe some other sources to essentially get into the mind of the average commuter and the economic trade-offs that they're making. And in that way, we can figure out what a property might rent for and what it might therefore sell for. By the way, in this example, we're going to make a few simplifying assumptions, like assuming employment is concentrated at the city center and that there's only one main artery to get there. But these are just so that we can kind of get to the crux of the matter, get the main idea. You can relax these assumptions in real life. It just takes a little more work. Still the same approach, but it's just going to be a bit more work than what we want to do for an example of just when we're trying to illustrate how the process works. So just a heads up. And so in addition, when we're talking about these assumptions, let's assume residential lots, they're uniformly 100 feet wide, so they're basically the same. The lots, property characteristics are the same. Hourly average wages, $20 an hour for the city. Round trip travel to the center of town, that's gonna average 20 miles per hour. I guess there's traffic. There's one worker per house, and that average worker makes 20 round trips per month. Basically a full work week, 20 working days, to the central business district. And also in this district, we have 318 households total. There are these are our parameters to work with. And in real life, you use the same parameters and approach. It's just that the numbers that you'd plug in, you'd get it from the US Census, a traffic app, maybe to figure out what commute times are to get downtown at peak hours, the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, to figure out wages, and then again the census to figure out population for the geographic area that you're trying to do this for. So the first step, we premise that workers, they want to be closer to work. And I can tell you, when I first moved to San Francisco for my first real job in finance, I wanted to live downtown because that was where the company I worked for was. I wanted to walk 10 minutes to work rather than, commute on the BART for like an hour. I really did not want to do that, and I was willing to pay extra, as much as I could at the time, to get an apartment that was close to work so I could focus on work rather than commute like more than 2 hours each day. And let me just say, I feel fortunate that I was able to do that, and I empathize with those of you that currently have to do that commute. When I was in Houston, for example, I was having to do that same type of commute, that long distance commute, and it totally sucked. But the point I'm trying to get across is that this bid rent model, it's a useful approximation of the way the average person thinks about their housing situation and their workplace. It essentially tries to quantify the cost of commuting into differences in property value. That's the main idea. At any rate, assuming that workers, they will pay to be closer to where they want to work, or closer to where they do work, let's attempt to quantify how much they would pay by using some data. And let's suppose that based on searching data at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the US Census, we found that the average wage of $20 per hour for this area. And so at a speed of 20 miles per hour, the cost of commuting per mile is $1 per mile. So we get that number, we take the $20 per hour and then divide it by 20 miles per hour. They both have the hour in the denominator, and so we can do that. And then what's left is dollar per mile as a ratio. So $1 per mile is like the average commuter's cost for this city. That's the cost per mile for their time by commuting instead of working. And if they're doing 20 round trips in a month, $1 per mile each way, that means that if they just live 1 mile closer, they'd save $1 times 20 times 2 for the round trip, or $40 per month. And that's the trade-off. For every mile of distance, the average worker faces $40 extra per month in cost in the form of time lost to commuting. What's interesting is that we can now apply that to housing in the city we're studying, specifically the relative price of housing as we get further out from the central business district where all the jobs are. If a worker is 3 miles away, for instance, they're facing an extra $120 per month in commuting costs, or 3 miles times that $40 we just calculated. And as you get closer, the costs of the commute decrease, where if you're 0 miles away, or in other words, within the city center itself, you face no commute costs whatsoever. And we can use this kind of extrapolation to figure out how much more people would be willing to pay to live closer to within the downtown city center. That table that we just looked at, this one here, is how you build the bid rent curve, which you see in this image here. It's a plot of that table that we just saw, and it shows the extra cost that someone is willing to pay in order to live in the central business district or close to it. So a property that is 1 mile away will go for $80 more per month, whereas a property that's 2 miles will go for less, at an additional $40 per month. And then this is all relative to our furthest away category, that 3-mile distance. So in other words, for a property that's within the central business district itself, someone will pay $120 more per month to have that, relative to a property that's situated 3 miles away. And they'll pay that extra amount because it saves them so much on their commute time. Now at this point, you might ask things like, well, what if you had a certain set of the population making more money than others? Or what if you had some of the population who will only consider walking and they don't have a car or don't want to use public transport, and they just want to walk? Or just generally the relevant questions which would occur in reality as you think more about this and apply it to a city, and how that might impact the analysis and its conclusions which we've just built on here. And it's really no problem to include and approximate these considerations into this bid rent model. It's only that it takes a little bit of extra work. And so in the next few minutes, let's take a few examples of how we might do that. Take our scenario with some set of the population being only walkers, for example. They only want to walk. And suppose 106 of them only want to walk to work, with the rest traveling by car. Here, we do the same thing as before, but for this walker population, we change their travel speed to work. So, given a typical walking speed of, like 3 miles per hour, and the same average wage, though, of $20 per hour, then the average time cost per mile for these walkers becomes $6.67, whereas before, for the drivers, we had $1. And so with this new $6.67 per mile for the walker group, given the same number of 20 round trips per month to work, to and from work, they'll be willing to pay $266.67 per month extra for every mile closer that they live to work. Basically, it's because, time is money, and the time to walk the same distance relative to driving is so much longer. And so this means that walkers will always be willing to pay more for closer downtown properties than any driver. But you can see it's the same formula and same steps. It's just that the time of commute has been lengthened. And this changes our demand curve, whereas previously drivers would pay up to $120 to live close to the central business district. Now they're all outbid by these walkers who they're willing to pay an extra $347 per month. The drivers are then concentrated further out, paying their premiums of $80 and $40 to live 1 and 2 miles out, respectively, relative to living furthest away at 3 miles. And we can further extend the depth of our analysis, and that's by including different income levels into the mix, rather than just using that $20 average. In a city, people make all sorts of different income. So let's take our archetypal well-paid job, for example, the doctor. We have 318 households, and 108 of them are still walkers instead of drivers. And now we also have 26 of these 318 total being highly paid doctors. I don't know, it's a big doctor town or something. Let's suppose they all have cars. Their commuting speed is the same as everyone else, 20 miles per hour. However, their wages are much higher. So instead of making the $20 per hour on average, they make $200 per hour. And then if time is money, this means that they value their time spent otherwise commuting much more highly. And how much more highly? Well, we can take that hourly wage of $200 per hour and then again divide it by that 20 mile per hour commuting speed. And we see that the premium for this highly paid subset is $20 per mile, the $200 divided by the 20 miles. So multiply that by 20 round trips, and you get the result that doctors will pay $400 to live just 1 mile closer to their workplace. And the conclusion is that even more than walkers, doctors will outbid all others to be closest to the central business district. And then readjusting our bid rent curve with this new data, we have doctors living closest and paying a hefty premium to live in and around the CBD, the central business district, walkers living a little further out, and then drivers remaining a mile or more outside. By the way, you might note that this graph shows $380 instead of the top 400. The reason is mathematical, and it relates to the fact that there were only 26 doctors out of our population of 318 households. So the $380 is the start of where the doctor group starts bidding. And then they start bidding at about a quarter a mile away. And so the very closest properties where distance equals 0, you have that maximum extra payment of $400. And then it steadily falls down to 380, where you get 0.25 miles, a quarter of a mile away from the center. And all the doctors at that point have bought up property, and then it moves to the walker subset. One more example of how you can adjust these bid rent curves for real world situations, and that's the fact that not all employment is going to be clustered in the central business district. I mean, suppose you have a situation where you have the central business district, but also separately, a little over a mile away, you have a medical district, and that's where all those high paying doctors actually work. And then you also have other people in the profession, the medical profession, who aren't quite as highly paid, but they also commute and travel to this location rather than the central business location. It's not unlike San Francisco, where just north of the Bay Bridge, you have the financial district and a lot of the tech companies. And then some of them in Soma, just south. But then that's the central business district. But then south of the Bay Bridge, maybe half a mile away, you have Mission Bay. That's where you have blocks upon blocks of biotechnology and medical buildings and hospitals like Kaiser. So in this case, we can still account for it. It's just that the bid rent curve gets some more complexity to it. You essentially have two peaks in this graph where the two major sources of employment exist. Same principles apply. It's just that now you have to calculate separately the time cost per mile commute of doctors and other medical professionals commute instead to the medical district, as well as the various commuters who work at the central business district. And by adding in these real-world features, we can start to see how a bid rent analysis might be useful as real estate professionals, because doing this type of analysis helps us decide the maximum lease rate that we can charge for this property, or by extension, what a rental property might sell for if we put it on the market. And as developers, it also tells us what type of property we should build if we've identified a particular plot of land for development, because now we're able to scout out who the commuters are in the area and how much they'd be willing to pay. Should be noted, though, that the more data and better data that we have on wages, commute patterns, local preferences, maybe there's a large group that simply really values living downtown, where it's more about lifestyle than it is about commute time alone. But the more data that we have to quantify these things, the more accurate that we can get with our pricing in a bid rent curve. But the bid rent curve, it can be a useful approximation to help us understand the value of real estate. It's just that often the more we can accurately include the complexity of the real world and the specifics of our local market with actual data, often the more reliable our bid rent model will be. Okay, last and final thing to discuss, a few ideas for describing the way cities grow. These concepts are less directly practical, and so I'll skim through them, but they're helpful to think about briefly just as an exercise in getting the bigger picture of ways in which a city may develop. These are three different, rather classical models for how a city may develop, and the first being the concentric circle model. And this was based on observing that cities tended to have a central downtown, followed by warehouse areas to service it, and then a transition zone before you got to increasing quality of housing stock. This was a model for an older type of city, and then subsequent models became a little more nuanced, like the second model for city growth that we'll take a look at. That second is what's called the Hoyt model. Here, the idea is that you have the central business district, and then building tends to revolve around that still. There's a light manufacturing or warehouse sector that runs this time along the district and all the way through the city, along with lower income residences situated between that industrial and either the central business district or neighboring residences. And then outside of that, you still have essentially the suburbs, in which middle income then high income development tends to take place. And then the third is the multinuclei pattern of describing city growth. And this basically acknowledges that cities tend to have a few concentrated areas of economic activity, not just the central business district. I mean, it's like our example where we had the CBD and then we also had a separate medical district. Multiple sources and areas of economic activity. And that's it. That's the 3 observed patterns of urban form.